I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, today's story takes us to Luxembourg City, which is in a relatively small country, but has a really big traffic problem. And Bill, the newly elected Democratic Prime Minister of that country, who actually re-elected, has decided to team up with the Social Democrats and the Green Party, and they are going to let everybody ride public transit for free. Now, before you react too harshly to this, oh, you capitalist.
I'm not about to, but go ahead.
No, well, okay. And here's why. Here's basically why they think that they should do this. Number one is their major goal is environmental friendliness. So they want to be able to reduce, vehicle emissions. But they also have, well, only like 110,000 people live in the city, but 400,000 others come to work there. And so they've got tremendous traffic problems. Not only would eliminating the cost of public transit get more people off the roads, but it would also eliminate the need to print and sell tickets or to police the use of those tickets. And all of this has to help productivity, since the average Luxembourg City driver spends some 33 hours a year sitting in traffic.
So I spend 33 hours a day or a week anyway, certainly sitting in traffic.
On the 401. So, Bill, let me just ask, maybe I've misanticipated how you would react to this. Do you actually think this is a good idea?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Really? Why come you say that?
Well, because everything in its place, right? As above, so below, Scott, presumably. Public transit seems to me to be a reasonable expense for a city to undertake. It seems to me to be a legitimate function of a city government to provide mass transit. And if the government is going to provide mass transit, I don't see any reason why you have to go to the trouble of charging people tickets on top of it and going through all the hoops and bells and whistles of it. If it's mass transit, it's mass transit. It is not a privately owned company. If you were talking about privatizing, I'm sorry, about the government taking over a private company, entirely different story. If this was a private company offering to provide mass transit, that'd be a different story. And I suspect that there is a private company trying very hard to provide mass transit, and I'd be willing to bet that company's name is Uber, but I don't know this for an absolute fact. I have been to Luxembourg once, by the way. I went from Miami to London via a just deregulated airline called International Air Bahamas. I spent 4 hours in the Bahamas. I spent 8 hours in Luxembourg, which was just enough time for me to go outside into the icy, wet clay and fall right down the side of a construction site and cover my entire front of my body with red Luxembourg clay, which then froze to me as I got on board the airplane and made my reception in London even more interesting. But no, I don't have any problem with this at all.
So you're basically saying, and I know you're not going to, they'll pry the steering wheel of your Camaro out of your cold dead hands.
Yes.
But are you basically saying you'd be willing to cough up a little extra in tax money to get that jackwagon out of the front of you when you're trying to travel down the highway?
I'm already paying a little in tax money, Scott. I'm paying a lot in tax money. And my experience living in California is they are bleeding us dry and not providing anything in return. My wife, who comes from one of the most rigid societies in the world, she was a young girl under the final years of the communist regime, talks about the fact that while nobody was allowed to make any money, and then you had to stand in line for various things, at least they provided things. You could go to college at no cost out of pocket. I won't say free because nothing's free, but you could get medical care at no cost out of pocket. And if the state took everything you made, at least the state gave you something in return. Here in California, they're just taking all our money and leaving us with just third world roads and all the rest of it. So I come back to my principles. I think that mass transit is a legitimate expense for a city government. I think that a tax for it is a legitimate and a reasonable thing to impose on the dwellers of that city. But my main point of departure, and probably the part you thought I was going to react to, is that if this were being mandated, if they were mandating private vehicles off the road, you'd have an entirely different reaction from me. But since this is a matter of individual choice, whether or not you want to get on a bus, get on an Uber, walk, or drive your bitchin' Camaro, then I don't have any problem with it at all.
So
By the way, you can drive from one end of Luxembourg and the other at about I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes.
Assuming no traffic.
Yeah,
But,
assuming no traffic.
but let's be clear about this, though. You seem to imply that somehow you were going to get this service at no additional charge from your local city government, but they're not. You know that the bill's not going to. They don't think they have enough money already. They're going to charge additional money in order to run this free public transit.
Okay, but how much of the cost of public transit, when you include the roads and the infrastructure and all the rest, how much of it is actually paid for by ticket prices? I just plain don't know the answer to that.
Not much.
But not much, yeah. So since this creature in my worldview is allowed to exist as a reasonable, expensive government, I don't have any problem with the fact that since it is mass public transit, they make it available to the mass public. And if this were to cause some enormous, the danger here, certainly in America, and even more certainly in California, is the danger in California would be that they would promise you this so-called free service. They would tax you until you were bleeding out of the eyes, and then they wouldn't provide the service. But I don't suspect that's going to happen in Luxembourg.
Well, and here's what is going to happen, though. I can almost guarantee you this, because the local city guys aren't going to want to jack up your taxes as much as would be required to provide this service for more people if more people began riding it. So what they're going to do is they're going to go to the federal government with hat in hand and say, hey, we want to be able to fight climate change and we want to be able to reduce traffic on the highways. So we need a federal grant to do this. And then the federal government is going to get involved and start force feeding this to other cities that aren't necessarily that interested in it. So where do you start losing interest in the concept? When it gets beyond the city, it goes to the federal or even the state government. Do you start to say, hey, wait a minute, this is a bad idea? Or are you okay if we have a nationally funded city transportation system?
Hey, man, I never said it was going to work in America. I just said I thought it was good for Luxembourg. At some point, we have to come to the shocking, irritating, disturbing, and somewhat incredible idea, really, that there are a few things that Europeans do better than we do. And this kind of tidy social integration is certainly one of them. I was considering the example of Luxembourg all the way through. In European countries, as a general rule, they don't look upon taxes as the way that we do. They're made out of different stuff. They're the stayers. We're the doers. They're the people that put up with the tyranny. We're the ones that left it. So I don't think the inclusion of a slight additional tax on your withered potatoes and your skinny chickens is going to be much of a burden for people to bear in Luxembourg, because they've been selected to bear that burden, because the people that wouldn't bear the burden aren't there anymore. They're over here. The reason that I say it would work in Luxembourg, and I have no doubt it would work in Luxembourg, and that it would be efficient and cost effective and all the rest of it, is for the same reason that I don't think it would work over here. Because over here, we're a nation of people who are selected for risk taking, and we're selected for an idea, and the idea that people take the risks for, it's a kind of a binary thing. You have to want to get here enough to take the risk, and you also have to want to get here enough because you have to like what you see here enough. And basically the entire idea of America is that when you really get it down to brass tacks, is we're going to bother you as little as possible. You can make as much or a little out of yourself as you want to. Now, that's a fine starting place for people who are motivated and disciplined and hard work, and most Americans are. But what happens is that we find in this country, we find that the spirit of entrepreneurial advancement and personal enrichment is often carried out by people through bureaucracies in the name of the public good. And so you've got these rascals doing these kind of things that you just mentioned that causes everything in this country to grow larger and larger and more expensive and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what works for 8 million people or 10 or whatever, or 5, how many people are in Luxembourg? I know there's at least a couple hundred. I've been there. Does not necessarily work across a continent with 320 unruly and generally cantankerous and rebellious people. So while you bring up a number of legitimate concerns for it here in America, I wasn't talking about it here in America. Look, the story of America in the first fifth of the 20th century is the is the story of the public sector taking control of what once was a free society with the grumbling acquiescence of the people who are the food source for these parasites.
Well, as long as, now specifically about the United States, I think as long as public transit is trying to make a go of it with user fees, they'll never make a go of it. It'll never get any bigger than it is now. It would seem to me in every experiment that I've seen that the only way that public transit survives is by being provided virtually free to a lot of its riders, if not all of its riders.
Right. I mean, and look, there's a couple of other guiding principles that we can hang on to with a fair degree of confidence. And one of them is push the power down as low as it'll possibly go. So rather than making this a federal issue or a state issue or even maybe a county issue, this should be it should be a city ordinance issue as much as possible. I've had the opportunity to ride Amtrak. I enjoyed the experience so much that I really would like to take a 2 or 3 day train trip. This is a guy who's flown hundreds and hundreds of times and really enjoyed the far western experience of Amtrak, not necessarily the commuter one. Although the commuter one in the east I thought worked rather well too. To me, it's about the responsibility, the fiscal responsibility of the people that are taking your money by force, and it's about having options and a lack of coercion. I'm not surprised that you're surprised to hear me say this, because I live in a state where the biggest boondoggle in American history is being perpetrated by this second. They've spent $200 billion, I think the number is, on a high-speed rail from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And if only there was some way to get from Los Angeles to San Francisco in a hurry, we wouldn't need the train. But wait a minute, come to think of it, there are probably 200 or 300 flights that make the trip in an hour and not in 5, and so on. The high-speed rail system here, I used to think, was a result of the liberals' burning desire to look good in the eyes of their European cultural superiors. But that was a naive assumption on my part. That's simply their psychological fig leaf. The real reason that the high-speed rail exists in California is because it is allowing $200 billion of taxpayer, hardworking business people's money being diverted into the pockets of politicians and a few corrupt contractors on something that is never going to be built, but is certainly going to be paid for many times over.
Well, you've heard of the Trump train, and some of you...
That mass transit I'm on. I'm in. I'm down with that. I'll get on the Trump train for sure. Because the nice thing about the Trump train is it's funded at individual expense.
That's right. And it's very similar to...
You're not riding the Trump train on somebody else's dime.
It's very similar to the Bill Whittle bus, which is $9.95 a month, and people get on the bus, and they are part of this adventure with us.
Let me just say one thing, just to wrap this up, because here's basically it. It's kind of like Disneyland or Disney World, right, Scott? It used to be that you would go to Disney World or Disneyland and you would pay a relatively small admission fee. And then once you got into the park, you had to decide how many A tickets, B tickets, C, D, and those golden E tickets you wanted to buy. And all the stuff that was worth riding was an E ticket. And then you get into the Country Beer Jamboree and it's a C or whatever. You'd see these A, B, C tickets lying on the ground at the end of the day. So when Disneyland and when Disney parks went to the idea of, look, this is silly, we're going to charge an admission price, and when you get into the park, you want any ride you want to. That makes a lot more sense to me, and that sounds like what they're trying to do with this idea of not charging a ticket on top of the money that you're already paying in taxes and the admission fees.
Well, it makes some sense. It'll be interesting to watch the experiment. At least it makes some sense in the context of their worldview. Whether it can be imported into the United States or not, well...
They're shriveled, tiny, myopic little worldview with their little tiny little trains and the tiny little country. I really do wish them the best. I'm sure it'll work.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you watching these programs that we make here 5 days a week, thanks to the beneficence of those members at BillWhittle.com. And if you'd like to become one of them, you can just go to BillWhittle.com, click that subscribe link. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.